Hello, my name is Maggie Bender,
And I am Jack Bearden.
and we are part of the RSM team supporting Dom with the administration of the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program. In advance of the execution of the grant agreements, we would like to highlight certain required documentation that you should anticipate submitting to Dom.
Before we get started, we'd like to briefly walk through today's agenda so you know what to expect during the session. First, we'll begin with an overview of the letter of credit and performance bond requirements, including the required thresholds and key considerations to keep in mind prior to award. Next, we'll cover the Cybersecurity Risk Management Plan and the Supply Chain Risk Management Plan. This section will focus on the purpose of these plans, required components, and what Dom will be looking for as part of the pre-award review process. We will then discuss tribal consent, including when it applies and the documentation that must be submitted. Following that, we'll review environmental and historic preservation requirements with an emphasis on common considerations and how these requirements may impact project timelines. We'll also walk through the process for submitting pre-award documentation, highlighting where and how documents should be submitted and common items that can delay review if incomplete. Toward the end of the session, we'll outline next steps so you have a clear understanding of what actions are expected following today's webinar. And finally, we'll close with additional resources, including reference materials and points of contact should you have any questions after the session.
Let's first discuss the letter of credit and performance bond requirements that apply to BEAD subgrants. Due to updated guidance from NTIA, subgrantees should be aware that either a letter of credit or performance bond is required and must meet or exceed 10% of the subgrant award amount. If you are providing a letter of credit, the line of credit established must be at an amount that meets or exceed at least 10% of the awarded amount. If your award amount has changed since your initial application and your existing letter of credit no longer meets this threshold, you will need to submit an updated copy with sufficient letter of credit value to DOM. The letter of credit must be issued by a well-capitalized bank or institution as defined under applicable federal banking regulations and insured by the FDIC. Credit unions insured by the NCUA may also issue letters of credit. In addition, banks rated BBB- or higher by NRSROs, as recognized by the SEC, may be used to receive an irrevocable standby letter of credit consistent with NTIA and BEAD program requirements. If you choose to provide a performance bond, it must be obtained within 60 days of grant agreement execution, if not received prior to execution. The performance bond must be valued at least 10% of the final grant agreement amount. If you opt for a performance bond, you do not need to provide a legal opinion stating that a letter of credit would not be considered part of your assets in the event of bankruptcy. DOM will review submitted letters of credit and performance bonds as part of the pre-award documentation process to ensure they meet all federal and program-specific requirements.
Based on updated NCIA guidance, the Iowa Department of Management believes that an initial 10% letter of credit or performance bond option is permissible, provided certain criteria are met. We'll briefly walk through each of those criteria. First, the eligible entity must issue funding on a reimbursable basis that is consistent with the NOFO. Practically speaking, this means DOM will provide subgrantees the opportunity to submit reimbursement-based claims, which will be facilitated through the Iowa grant system. Second, reimbursement is limited to periods of no more than 6 months. Subrecipients may submit claims in Iowa grants on a semi-annual basis. If no eligible costs are incurred during a given 6-month period, a claim is not required for that interval. Finally, the subgrantee must commit to maintaining a letter of credit or performance bond greater than or equal to 10% of the subaward amount. This requirement remains in place until the subgrantee has demonstrated satisfactory completion of the build-out. Specifically, this means either achieving 100% of the locations served by the project as validated by DOM, or until the performance period of the subaward has ended, whichever occurs first.
Moving on to the Cybersecurity Risk Management Plan and the Supply Chain Risk Management Plan. Starting with the Cybersecurity Risk Management Plan on the left side of the slide, if an existing plan does not already exist, subgrantees must prepare a cybersecurity risk management plan and have it in place prior to the award of the grant if service is already being provided in the awarded area. If service has not yet begun, the plan must be ready to be operationalized upon providing service. This plan must meet several key requirements. It should reflect the most recent version of the NIST cybersecurity framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity and align with the standards and controls outlined in Executive Order 14028, which addresses security and privacy concerns for critical infrastructure systems. The cybersecurity plan must be submitted to DOM prior to execution of the grant agreement. Additionally, if any substantive changes are made after submission, an updated version must be provided to DOM within 30 days. On the right side of the slide is a supply chain risk management plan. Similar to the cybersecurity plan, if a plan does not already exist, subgrantees must prepare one and have it in place prior to grant award if service is already being provided, or be ready to operationalize it when service begins. This plan must be based on key practices as discussed in the resources provided on the slide. It also must clearly specify the controls that will be implemented to manage and mitigate supply chain risks. Prior to execution of the grant agreement, both plans must be submitted to DOM using the Cybersecurity and Supply Chain Risk Management form in Iowa grants. Together, these plans help maintain that funded projects meet federal cybersecurity expectations and appropriately manage risks associated with technology, vendors, and supply chains.
Let's discuss tribal consent next. For any project that overlaps with tribal lands, applicants must provide documented proof of consent from the associated tribal nation. The following documents must be completed and submitted via the BEAD tribal consent form in Iowa grants by no later than May 17th, 2026. Applicants must submit a formal request letter to the tribal chairperson seeking consent for the project and a signed official letter from the tribal chairperson confirming approval of the project. The formal request letter itself must include several key elements. This includes a concise description of the project, identifying the entities responsible for deploying and operating the broadband network. The letter should describe the technology that will be deployed and the anticipated time frame of the agreement. It should also explain the land involved, including ownership status and any necessary permissions, and clearly articulate how the project will benefit the tribe. Additionally, applicants should describe the expected participation of the tribe in the project and include any other relevant information that may support the request. Consent from tribe documentation must include authorized signatures from the tribal governing authority. The submission should identify the tribal government and the associated tribal lands as recognized under the federally recognized Indian Tribe List Act of 1994. The consent letter must also reference the BEAD NOFO and include the date the consent was provided.
This slide provides a high-level overview of the pre-award environmental requirements that must be completed before any grant-funded project activities may begin. As a reminder, subrecipients may not begin any grant-funded project activities until all applicable environmental reviews and compliance requirements have been fully completed. Starting at the top, the first requirement is the NEPA review. This review is required under the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. The review outcome will be documented through one of the following determinations as applicable: a categorical exclusion, a record of environmental consideration, a finding of no significant impact, or a record of decision. The specific determination will depend on the scope and nature of the project. Next is the NHPA review, which is conducted under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. This review evaluates potential impacts to historic properties and includes any required consultations with the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, as well as federally recognized Native American tribes when applicable. In addition to NEPA and NHPA, some projects may require additional federal reviews. These can include consultations with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service under the Endangered Species Act, as well as reviews under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, depending on project characteristics such as ground disturbance or impacts to waterways. Finally, subrecipients may demonstrate regulatory compliance with all other applicable federal, state, and local environmental laws and regulations. This includes ensuring that all required permits, approvals, and consultations are obtained before proceeding. Together, these steps maintain that projects meet environmental and historic preservation requirements before moving into implementation, helping avoid delays or compliance issues later in the project lifecycle.
Iowa's BEAD program is intended to fund a broad range of broadband activities. However, for last-mile broadband deployment projects, it is important to note that implementation activities such as site preparation, demolition, construction, ground disturbance, fixed installation, or any other physical build activities may not begin until all EHP requirements have been fully completed as outlined in this section. That said, based on guidance issued by the NTIA, DOM will allow certain permissible activities under NEPA to proceed using awarded funds before the EHP review process is complete. These permissible activities are limited in scope and are primarily focused on planning, analysis, and preparation. Examples include pre-construction planning, including collecting information necessary to complete environmental reviews. Applicants may also use funds to prepare and submit applications for environmental permits, as well as conduct studies and analyses, such as environmental assessments, wetland delineations, biological assessments, archaeological surveys, and any other required environmental reviews. In addition, pre-award application costs are allowable, along with activities that support required consultations under the National Historic Preservation Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Clean Water Act. Limited preliminary procurement activities are also permitted. This can include purchasing or leasing equipment, entering into non-binding contracts, purchasing insurance, or securing land or building leases, including right-of-way easements, provided these activities do not result in construction or irreversible commitments. It is important to emphasize that subrecipients who undertake unauthorized project activities do so at their own risks. Costs incurred in violation of these requirements may be deemed ineligible and may result in a loss of funding. Additionally, if costs are incurred prior to the execution of the final award agreement, those costs are also incurred at the applicant's own risk and may be rejected if determined to be unallowable.
This slide provides an overview of the required activities related to NEPA and NHPA that must be completed at key points in the grant lifecycle. Prior to the distribution of any funds, subgrantees must complete the Environmental and Historic Preservation, or EHP, form in Iowa grants. This submission must include the project's milestone schedule, which is used to align environmental review activities with project implementation timelines. Within 30 days of entering into a subgrant agreement, the grantee is required to provide DOM with a draft milestone schedule. This schedule should clearly reflect NEPA and NHPA permitting and review milestones. A sample NEPA and permitting milestone schedule is available on DOM's website and can be used as a reference when developing your submission. Finally, prior to the first disbursement of funds, all required environmental and historic preservation documentation must be fully approved by NTIA. Additionally, any changes to the project scope, design, or activities that could affect environmental or historic impacts must receive written approval from NTIA as well as the NIST grants officers before those changes can move forward.
This is an overview of the pre-award documentation discussed and a reminder of when and where to submit when available. The letter of credit must be submitted by grant agreement execution, while the performance bond must be submitted within 60 days of execution of the grant agreement. Either document should be submitted via the supplemental data collection form in Iowa grants. The cybersecurity risk management plan and the supply chain risk management plan must be submitted prior to grant agreement execution using the cybersecurity and supply chain risk management form in Iowa grants. All applicable environmental and historic preservation activities must be fully completed prior to the distribution of any funds. The required documentation is submitted through the environmental and historic preservation form in Iowa grants. Finally, for projects that include tribal lands, tribal consent documentation must be submitted to DOM by no later than May 17, 2026, and before execution of the grant agreement. This documentation can be submitted using the BEAD tribal consent form in Iowa grants.
The following are the next steps with the BEAD program. First, applicants must submit all required pre-award documentation within the applicable timeframe and through the appropriate submission forms in Iowa grants. Once pre-award documentation has been reviewed and approved, the process moves to grant agreement execution. At this stage, applicants will receive the grant agreement for review and signature. Grant agreements must be reviewed and signed within 10 business days to avoid delays in moving the project forward. After the grant agreement is fully executed, the project enters the project execution and subrecipient monitoring phase. During this phase, DOM will actively monitor subrecipients to ensure continued compliance with program requirements, grant terms, and applicable federal and state regulations throughout the life of the project. Finally, as noted at the bottom of the slide, a subsequent webinar will be held during the grant agreement execution period. This webinar will provide additional details on BEAD program requirements and key grant agreement provisions.
For your awareness, additional resources can be located at DOM's BEAD webpage within the Applicant Toolkits Program Documentation section, as shown here. Comments, questions, and concerns can be sent to broadband@dom.iowa.gov. We thank you for your time and attention and look forward to your partnership with the BEAD program.